The sounds were muffled by the heavy velvet curtains and the sheer size of the room, a secret symphony of soft gasps and the whisper of skin against Egyptian cotton. Ilara. God. We can't. Ethan's voice was a ragged breath, torn between the last vestiges of his conscience and the overwhelming pull of the moment. A soft moan was his answer, a sound of pure, unadulterated pleasure that vibrated against his lips. But we are, Ethan. We are, she whispered back, her fingers digging into the muscles of his back, pulling him deeper, erasing any possibility of retreat. She silenced his half-formed protest with a kiss that tasted of expensive whiskey, lingering grief, and a desperate, forbidden hunger that had been starving for weeks. The night outside was cold and still, but within the walls of his father's master bedroom, a fire was raging, consuming everything in its path, especially the line between right and wrong, between mourning and desire. It hadn't started like this, with heat and desperation. It had started with ice, 3 weeks earlier. The chill of a late autumn afternoon had seeped into Ethan's car as he made the long drive from his sterile New York City apartment to the sprawling Connecticut estate he had once called home. 1 month had passed since the funeral, a somber affair of polite handshakes and murmured condolences that felt more like a business transaction than a farewell. He was here now as the executor of his father's will, a final duty to a man he had respected more than he had loved. The manor loomed at the end of the winding driveway, its stone facade looking gray and weary under the fading light. As he stepped out of the car, the silence was the first thing that struck him, an oppressive weight where the booming voice of his father, Richard, should have been. The door opened before he could knock. Ilara stood there, framed in the doorway, his father's wife, his stepmother. She wore a simple black silk dress that fell to her knees, its starkness accentuating the pale column of her throat and the quiet sorrow in her dark, watchful eyes. She was not the weeping widow he had half expected. There was a fragile composure about her, an elegance that seemed almost out of place amidst the raw finality of death. "Ethan," she said, her voice soft yet clear in the heavy air, "I was waiting for you." He stepped inside, the familiar scent of old wood, leather, and his father's cigars now mingled with something new, something floral and distinctly hers. The great house was empty, save for the two of them, and in the vast, echoing space, attention began to coil, a silent, unseen thing born from shared loss and a sudden, dangerous solitude. The day of the funeral had been a masterpiece of curated sorrow. Richard would have approved. It was grand, impeccably organized, and attended by a who's who of Wall Street titans, aging politicians, and women in expensive black hats who had known him in various capacities over the decades. Ethan stood apart from the main throng, feeling like a ghost at his own father's farewell. He listened to the eulogies, each one painting a portrait of a brilliant, ruthless, and charming man he barely recognized. His own relationship with Richard had been one of respectful distance, of expectations met and emotional chasms left unbridged. But as he stood there, his eyes were not on the polished mahogany casket. They were on Ilara. He watched her, expecting to see the performance of a young widow who had just secured a fortune. He anticipated dramatic tears, a fainting spell, the kind of ostentatious grief that would confirm all his cynical assumptions about her. Instead, he saw a stillness that was more profound than any wail of sorrow. She stood beside the grave, a slender figure draped in a perfectly tailored black wool coat, a delicate veil obscuring the upper half of her face. But it couldn't hide the rigid set of her jaw, or the way her gloved hands were clasped so tightly in front of her that her knuckles must have been white. She didn't weep. She simply stood, an effigy of quiet, dignified pain. And for the first time, Ethan found himself looking at her, truly looking, not as Richard's wife, but as a woman navigating an impossible moment. He saw the subtle tension in her shoulders, the almost imperceptible tremor in her hands as she accepted the folded flag. He saw a profound and unnerving loneliness. Later, back at the manor, the performance continued, but it was the guests who were the actors now. They filled the grand halls with the low hum of feigned sympathy, their eyes scanning the expensive art and calculating the estate's worth. Ethan nursed a glass of scotch in a corner, observing. Ilara moved through the crowd with a somber grace that both impressed and unsettled him. She was the perfect hostess, even in mourning. She accepted condolences, offered quiet words of thanks, and ensured everyone's glass was full. Ethan watched as one of his father's oldest business partners, a man named Marcus Thorne with a predatory smile and wandering hands, cornered her by the fireplace. He saw the way Marcus leaned in too close, his hand lingering on her arm for a fraction of a second too long. Ethan saw the flicker in Alara's eyes, a brief flash of something disgust, fear, before her mask of serene composure slipped back into place. A surge of protective anger, hot and unfamiliar, rose in Ethan's chest. Who was this woman? This stranger who shared his last name, who had slept in his father's bed. He had painted her with the broad, dismissive brush of a gold digger, a beautiful ornament for an aging tycoon. But the woman he was watching now didn't fit that simple caricature. The woman he was watching seemed utterly, terrifyingly alone, adrift in a sea of sharks who smelled blood in the water. In the days that followed the funeral, after the last of the mourners had departed and a heavy silence had settled over the estate, Ethan's observations of Alara became more focused, almost obsessive. He was supposed to be in Richard's study, sorting through decades of financial documents and legal papers, but he found his attention constantly drifting. He would hear the soft padding of her footsteps in the hallway, or catch the faint scent of her perfume, a subtle blend of jasmine and something warmer, like sandalwood. He began to learn the rhythm of her grief. She would spend hours in the vast library, not reading, but simply sitting in one of the large leather armchairs, staring into the cold fireplace. He saw her once in the garden, Richard's prized rose garden, her fingers tracing the edge of a late-blooming crimson petal with a tenderness that seemed achingly real. She wore simple clothes now, soft cashmere sweaters and tailored trousers that did little to hide the elegant lines of her body. He started noticing things an architect would appreciate: the graceful curve of her neck, the delicate structure of her wrists, the way she carried herself with a dancer's poise. But his appreciation was slowly, insidiously, becoming something else. One afternoon, he walked past the music room, and the door was slightly ajar. He paused. Alara was sitting at the grand piano, her back to him. She wasn't playing. Her shoulders were shaking with silent, racking sobs. The perfect, unshakable composure was gone, and in its place was a vulnerability so raw it felt like a physical blow. He saw her not as a widow, not as a stepmother, but simply as a woman crying alone in a silent house. He wanted to go to her, to offer some kind of comfort, but he felt paralyzed, an intruder on a private sorrow he had no right to witness. He quietly backed away, his heart pounding with a confusing mix of sympathy and something he was terrified to name. The image of her trembling shoulders, of that carefully constructed dam of grief finally breaking, imprinted itself on his mind. The portrait of Alara he had carried in his head, the beautiful, calculating trophy wife, was shattering, and in its place, a far more complex and dangerously compelling picture was beginning to emerge. Sleep became a stranger to Ethan in that house. The silence, which he had initially craved after the noise of the city, was now a living entity, amplifying every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside his window. His nights were long, restless journeys through memories of his father, each one tinged with a fresh coat of regret and unanswered questions. It was on the third night, wandering the darkened hallways in a futile search for peace, that he saw a sliver of light from under the library door. He pushed it open gently. Alara was there, curled in one of the enormous wingback chairs by the fireplace, a glass of amber liquid cradled in her hands. The fire was not lit, and the only light came from a single green-shaded lamp on Richard's massive desk, casting long shadows that made the room feel both intimate and cavernous. She looked up as he entered, her eyes wide and dark in the dim light. There was no surprise in them, only a quiet recognition of a fellow insomniac. She didn't speak, but simply gestured with her glass towards the bar cart in the corner. It was an invitation. He poured himself a generous measure of his father's favorite single malt scotch, the peaty aroma filling his senses with a pang of nostalgia. He took the chair opposite hers. For a long while they said nothing, simply sharing the silence that felt less oppressive with two people in it. He loved this room, she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. He called it the fortress. the only place the world couldn't reach him. Ethan nodded, swirling the whiskey in his glass. He spent more time in here than he did with any of us. The words came out sharper than he intended, a sliver of old resentment breaking the surface. He expected her to defend Richard, to offer a platitude. Instead, she looked at him with an unnerving understanding. He didn't know how to be anywhere else, she said. The quiet scared him. The man who could command boardrooms and bend markets to his will was terrified of silence. It was a revelation. Ethan had only ever seen the commander, the titan. He had never considered the possibility of his father's fear. That first conversation opened a door. It became their ritual, an unspoken appointment in the dead of night. Every evening, after the pretense of trying to sleep was abandoned, they would meet in the library. Fueled by whiskey and the shared solitude of the cavernous house, the walls between them began to dissolve. They talked about Richard, but they were really talking about the spaces he had left in their lives. Alara spoke of a man Ethan had never known, a man who would read poetry to her, who confessed his fears of growing old, who bought her a first edition of her favorite novel, not because it was expensive, but because he remembered her mentioning it months earlier. Her stories didn't absolve Richard in Ethan's eyes, but they colored him in, transforming him from a monolithic figure of power into a flawed, complex human being. In return, Ethan found himself opening up in a way he never had before. He told her about the crushing weight of being Richard's son, the constant pressure to succeed, the hollow feeling of achievements that were never quite enough. He spoke of his childhood, of a father who was more present in the pages of Forbes magazine than at his school plays or baseball games. "I think," he said one night, staring into the bottom of his glass, "I spent my whole life trying to get his attention, and now that he's gone, I don't even know if he was ever really looking." Alara listened, her gaze steady and compassionate. She didn't offer empty reassurances. She simply listened, and in her listening, he felt a sense of validation, of being seen, that his own father had never given him. The formal labels of stepson and stepmother melted away in the warm, whiskey-soaked air of the library. They were just Ethan and Alara, two people of a similar age, bound by the gravitational pull of a dead man's legacy. With this newfound emotional intimacy came a subtle but undeniable shift in the energy between them. He became acutely aware of her presence. He noticed the way the soft lamplight caught the curve of her collarbone, the way she would bite her lower lip when she was thinking, the faint, clean scent of her skin from across the space that separated their chairs. Their eye contact began to linger, holding for a beat too long before one of them would self-consciously look away. The breaking point came on a Tuesday, nearly a week into their nocturnal confessions. They were discussing Richard's strange fascination with pre-war literature. He had a copy of The Sun Also Rises, Ethan recalled, a first edition. He said it was the most honest book ever written about being lost. Alara's face lit up with a flicker of excitement. "I know the one." He kept it on the high shelf, over by the window, the one with the blue leather binding. As if pulled by the same string, they both rose and walked towards the towering, built-in bookshelf. The library ladder was heavy, and they stood side by side, looking up. "I can see it," she said, pointing. "Just there." She reached up on her toes, her fingers brushing the spine. At the same moment, Ethan reached up as well, his larger hand covering hers as they both made contact with the book. It wasn't a brush, it was a connection. A current, hot and startling, shot up his arm. He felt the delicate bones of her hand under his, the warmth of her skin. He heard her sharp, involuntary intake of breath. Everything stopped. The air grew thick, heavy with everything that had been left unsaid in their late-night talks. They were no longer talking about his father or her husband. They were in a new territory, a dangerous and electrifying place that had nothing to do with the past. He could feel the slight tremor in her hand. Slowly, as if moving through water, they both pulled their hands back. He didn't dare look at her, instead staring intently at the book on the shelf, as if it held all the secrets of the universe. The comfortable intimacy of their sanctuary was shattered, replaced by a crackling, terrifying awareness. After a silence that stretched for an eternity, she finally broke it, her voice strained. "It's late," she murmured, not looking at him. I should go to bed." She turned and walked out of the library, leaving Ethan standing alone in front of the bookshelf, his hand still tingling from the ghost of her touch. The morning after their encounter in the library, the atmosphere in the house was thick with unspoken words. The easy camaraderie of their late-night confessions had evaporated, replaced by a stilted, excruciating politeness. Their good mornings in the hallway were clipped, their gazes skittering away from each other as if by mutual agreement. Ethan tried to immerse himself in his father's paperwork, but the numbers and legal clauses blurred into an indecipherable mess. His mind was not on the estate. It was on the ghost of a touch, the memory of the warmth of her hand under his. The avoidance, he soon realized, was a terrible mistake. By trying not to see her, he saw her everywhere. He became a connoisseur of her presence, an unwilling scholar of her every move. His senses were heightened, tuned to the specific frequency of Alara. He learned to distinguish the soft click of her heels on the marble floor from the creaks and groans of the old house. He would be sitting in the study, and a faint trail of her jasmine and sandalwood perfume would drift in from the hallway, and his focus would shatter instantly. He started noticing the intimate details of her existence, details that were both innocent and intoxicating. He saw the gentle curve of her calf as she reached for a book on a low shelf, the delicate indentation of her spine visible for a second as her sweater rode up her back. He saw the way the sunlight from the conservatory window caught the reddish highlights in her dark hair, turning it to spun bronze. He saw the faint outline of her lace bra through a white silk blouse, and felt a jolt, sharp and illicit, go straight through him. Each observation was a small sin, a tiny betrayal of his father's memory, and yet he couldn't stop. He was starving, and he hadn't even realized he was hungry. The temptation, which had been a subtle, creeping vine, took root and bloomed into a monstrous flower one dreary afternoon. A persistent rain had been falling since dawn, trapping them inside and magnifying the tension between them to an unbearable degree. Restless and agitated, Ethan left the stuffy confines of the study to wander the house. It was his feet, not his mind, that led him toward the west wing, toward the echoing, glass-paned building that housed the indoor pool. He was drawn by a sound he hadn't heard since he was a boy, the rhythmic, hypnotic splash of a swimmer cutting cleanly through the water. He pushed the heavy glass door open a crack, his mind expecting to find the pool empty, the sounds a mere echo of memory. But it wasn't empty. She was there, Alara. She was gliding from one end of the pool to the other with a fluid, powerful grace. He froze in the doorway, partially hidden by a large potted palm, his heart beginning a low, heavy drumbeat against his ribs. She was wearing a simple, dark blue bikini, a stark splash of color against the pale turquoise of the water, and as she reached the end of the lane and hoisted herself out of the pool in one effortless motion, his breath caught in his throat. The architect in him, the man who understood form and function, was silenced by the primal, unfiltered response of a man seeing a beautiful woman. The water streamed from her body, clinging to her skin like a second transparent layer. He watched the droplets trace paths over the elegant curve of her shoulders and down the valley between her breasts. The dark blue fabric of the bikini top did little to conceal their full, perfect shape, their graceful swell promising a softness that made his hands ache to touch. His eyes traveled lower, down the taut, pale expanse of her stomach, to the gentle, feminine flare of her hips. Her body was a study in intoxicating contrasts, slender but strong, delicate but womanly. The curve of her waist, the swell of her hips, the long, toned line of her legs. It was a perfect, living sculpture, and he was a thief, stealing this vision of her from the shadows. The air in the natatorium was warm and humid, thick with the chemical tang of chlorine, but all Ethan could smell was some phantom scent of her perfume, now mixed with the clean, wet scent of her skin. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, a voyeur consumed by a desire so potent it felt like a sickness. It was a profane longing, born in a house of mourning, and he hated himself for it. But the hatred was a distant, intellectual thing. The wanting was immediate, visceral, and overwhelming. As if she could feel the weight of his stare, she suddenly stopped, her hand frozen on the towel she was reaching for. She turned her head slowly, her dark, wet hair slicked back from her face, exposing the beautiful, vulnerable line of her neck. Her gaze swept the room and locked onto his, right through the fronds of the palm. There was no flicker of surprise, no blush of embarrassment or anger. Her expression was calm, unreadable, but her eyes held his with a directness that was both terrifying and thrilling. It was not an accusation, it was a question. It was a quiet, shattering acknowledgement of the truth that now hung in the air between them. In that moment, with her body glistening under the artificial lights, she was not his father's grieving widow. She was Eve in the garden, and the air itself felt heavy with the scent of temptation. Ethan pulled back from the door, his heart hammering, and retreated down the hall. The image of her beautiful, defiant, and utterly desirable burned permanently into his mind. The line had been crossed, not by a touch, but by a look. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that there was no going back. The look they had shared across the humid air of the swimming pool had severed the last thread of plausible deniability. There was no longer any room for self-deception. The space between Ethan and Alara was now filled with a raw, humming energy, a dangerous acknowledgement that made the vast, silent rooms of the manor feel claustrophobic. They spent the next day in a state of carefully orchestrated avoidance, moving through the house like two opposing magnets, acutely aware of each other's location at all times. If he was in the study, she would remain in the east wing. If she came down to the kitchen for tea, he would suddenly find a reason to go upstairs. But the silence was a poor defense. It did nothing to quiet the riot in Ethan's mind, where the image of her wet, glistening body was on a continuous, torturous loop. The rain that had begun the day before continued relentlessly, a steady, dreary drumming against the window panes that mirrored the turmoil inside him. The house felt like a ship adrift in a gray, endless sea, with just the two of them trapped aboard. The tension finally broke that evening. The storm outside had escalated into a full-throated gale, wind rattling the old window frames. Ethan found Alara in the main gallery, a long, formal room filled with Richard's eclectic and expensive art collection. She was standing before a large, chaotic, abstract painting, a violent swirl of crimson and black that dominated the entire wall. He remembered the day his father had bought it. He had privately thought it was a garish waste of money. He approached her, intending to say something neutral, something to break the suffocating silence, but the words that came out were clinical and cold. "The appraisers are coming on Friday," he said, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "We'll need a full inventory. That one," he gestured to the canvas, "should probably be first on the list. It's likely one of the most valuable." Alara didn't turn to look at him. She continued staring at the painting, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were cold. "It's not for sale," she said quietly. Ethan felt a prickle of irritation. "Alara, everything is part of the estate. It all has to be valued. That's how this works." "I know how it works," she snapped, finally turning to face him. Her eyes were bright with an emotion he couldn't quite place. "But this one stays. It was the first piece Richard and I bought together." Ethan let out a short, mirthless laugh. "Together?" "Alara, my father didn't do together. He acquired things. He acquired you." The cruelty of the words hung in the air the moment he said them. He saw the flash of hurt in her eyes, raw and deep, and for a second, he wanted to take them back. But it was too late. Her face hardened, her composure turning into a cold fury. "You know nothing," she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. "You came here twice a year for a stilted holiday dinner and you think you knew him? You saw the monument. I lived with the man. I saw the cracks. I saw the loneliness you and your perfect, distant life left in him." Her words were like slaps, each one landing with precision. "Don't you dare!" he shot back, stepping closer, his own anger rising to meet hers. "Don't you dare pretend this was some great romance. You were a beautiful distraction, a final acquisition for his collection. And what were you?" she cried, her voice breaking. "You were his greatest disappointment. The son who was too good for the family business, too ashamed of the man who gave him everything." They were standing chest to chest now, the massive, violent painting, a fitting backdrop to their own storm. They were breathing heavily, their faces inches apart, the air thick with rain, rage, and 3 weeks of unspoken, forbidden want. The argument had burned away every last defense, leaving them raw and exposed. He could see the pulse beating frantically in the hollow of her throat. He could smell the faint scent of jasmine on her skin, even over the smell of the rain and old oil paint. and in her dark, tear-filled eyes he saw not only anger, but the same desperate longing that was clawing its way up his own throat. He didn't think, he acted. He closed the small distance between them, his hand coming up to cup the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her soft hair. He crashed his mouth down onto hers. It was a kiss of pure, unadulterated fury. It was punishment and confession, a desperate attempt to conquer the feeling that was conquering him. It was brutal and hungry, filled with all the anger and grief and loneliness that had brought them to this point. For a moment, she was rigid, her hands coming up to push hard against his chest, a muffled sound of protest in her throat. He felt her resistance, and a part of him, the sane part, screamed at him to stop. But then, something shifted. Her hands, which had been pushing him away, suddenly fisted in the fabric of his shirt, clinging to him. Her body, once stiff with shock, melted against his. The dam broke. She kissed him back with a ferocity that stole the air from his lungs. It was no longer a battle, it was a surrender, a mutual, cataclysmic surrender. Her lips were soft and pliant under his, and she tasted of salt from her tears, of wine from the glass she must have had earlier, and of a deep, intoxicating sweetness that was hers alone. It was a kiss that devoured, that consumed, that demanded everything. When they finally broke apart, they were both panting, their chests heaving. They stared at each other, horrified and electrified. The rain lashed against the windows, but in the gallery, a new, more terrifying silence had fallen. The unbreachable line had been crossed. The world had tilted on its axis. And in the shocked, dilated pupils of her eyes, Ethan saw his own guilt and his own terrible, undeniable desire reflected back at him. He had started this. He had unleashed this, and he was terrified of it. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing on the polished floor. He fled the room, fled her, fled the overwhelming, catastrophic truth of what he had just done, leaving Alara alone in the shadows, her trembling fingers rising to touch her swollen lips. Escape offered no sanctuary. Ethan reached his room, the guest suite at the far end of the hall, and shut the door, leaning his back against the heavy wood as if he could physically block out what had just happened. But the ghost of the kiss was not in the gallery. It was on his lips, a phantom heat that refused to fade. It was in his lungs, which still struggled to draw a full breath. It was seared onto the backs of his eyelids. He slid down the door until he was sitting on the floor, his head in his hands, the sound of the rain and his own ragged breathing filling the silence. His mind, usually an ordered place of blueprints and calculations, was now a maelstrom of shame, guilt, and a terrifying, exhilarating pleasure. He had fled from her, but she had followed him, taking up residence inside his own head. The avoidance was over. The obsession had begun. He was an architect, a man who understood structure, who believed every effect had a cause. And so, in the silent, storm-lashed darkness, he began a desperate forensic examination of his own desire, trying to map its origins, to understand its brutal and elegant geometry. He was performing an anatomy of the want that was threatening to unmake him. He started with the kiss. He replayed it, frame by agonizing frame, the anger that had propelled him forward, the brief, satisfying shock in her eyes, the feeling of her soft lips, so much softer than he had imagined, yielding to the force of his. He remembered the moment of her resistance, the firm press of her palms against his chest, a final, futile gesture of defiance. And then, the surrender. He felt it again now, a visceral memory, the subtle relaxing of her body, the way she had leaned into him, her hands clenching his shirt. It was the surrender that was undoing him. Not his aggression, but her reciprocation. She had met his hunger with her own. He could still taste her, the faint, lingering trace of wine, the salt of her tears, a unique, clean sweetness that was purely Alara. He had wanted to punish her, to hurt her for the power she had over him, but he had ended up branding himself. Now, he began to dissect the vessel of that power, the woman herself. His mind, freed from the constraints of propriety, became a voyeuristic theater, replaying every stolen glance, every suppressed observation. The pool. The image returned, no longer a hazy, guilt-ridden memory, but a high-definition fantasy. He saw her rising from the water, a modern Venus. His architect's eye, which had once clinically appreciated her form, now caressed it with an owner's longing. He traced the lines of her body in his mind's eye, the graceful slope of her shoulders, the delicate cage of her ribs, the swell of her breasts, round and high, barely restrained by the dark blue fabric. He imagined the weight of them in his hands. He followed the curve of her narrow waist flaring into the perfect, gentle sweep of her hips. He had watched her walk away from the pool, and his memory had, without his permission, catalogued the sight of her long legs, the taut curve of her buttocks. It was a body built for both elegance and sin, and the thought of it, the sheer, unadulterated carnality of it, sent a wave of heat through him that had nothing to do with shame and everything to do with raw, animal need. But it was more than just a body, and that was the truly terrifying part. His obsession was not so clean, not so simple. He remembered a moment from the summer before Richard had gotten sick. There had been a stiflingly formal garden party at the manor. Ethan had been bored, nursing a drink and trying to avoid his father's colleagues. Alara had been wearing a simple, pale yellow sundress. At one point, she had thrown her head back to laugh at something one of the guests had said, a genuine, uninhibited peal of laughter. The sun had caught in her hair, and for a single startling moment, she had looked young and carefree and achingly beautiful. He had felt a strange pang in his chest then, a feeling he had quickly dismissed and buried. Now, the memory returned with the force of a revelation. It was her laughter. It was the intelligence in her eyes during their late-night talks in the library. It was the quiet dignity with which she had endured the funeral, the hidden vulnerability he had witnessed when he saw her crying at the piano. It was the flash of fire in her eyes in the gallery just before he kissed her. It was the whole of her, the entire complex, infuriating, desirable woman. He recalled a conversation where she'd bent down to pick up a fallen book, and for a fleeting second, the collar of her silk blouse had gaped, revealing the delicate edge of black lace against her pale skin. The image, so brief he had barely registered it at the time, now played in his mind with pornographic clarity. He was a man drowning, and every memory, every sensory detail, was another hand pushing him under. The voice of his father echoed in his conscience, a deep baritone of condemnation. My wife, in my own house. The shame was a physical thing, a cold knot in his stomach. But then he would close his eyes, and the shame would be incinerated by the memory of her taste, by the imagined scent of her skin, by the pure, undeniable fact of his desire. The battle was a lie. He had already lost. The question was no longer if, but when. He rose from the floor and walked to the window, looking out at the rain-streaked darkness. He was no longer just his father's son, grieving in his father's house. He was a man consumed. He wanted Alara, and the anatomy of that desire was simple. Every part of him wanted every part of her. For 2 days after the kiss, the house was a tomb. The silence between Ethan and Alara was no longer a void, but a solid object, a wall they had built between them brick by excruciating brick. They ate at different times. They occupied opposite ends of the manor, but the physical distance was a farce. Ethan felt her presence like a low-grade fever, a constant thrumming under his skin. He had analyzed his desire, dissected it, and cataloged it, but the knowledge did nothing to diminish its power. It only made it stronger. The torment of inaction became unbearable, a slow, grinding torture of the soul. He knew he could not go on like this, living in the same house, breathing the same air, his mind a constant, repeating reel of her taste, her scent, her surrender. Something had to break. On the third night, he knew it would be the night. The decision wasn't a conscious thought, but a quiet, cold certainty that settled in his bones. He lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the old house groan around him. He was done fighting. He was done running. He rose from his bed, his movements deliberate. He didn't bother to dress, wearing only the boxer briefs he slept in. He opened his door and stepped into the chilled, dark hallway. The portraits of his ancestors stared down at him with dark, accusing eyes, none more so than the large oil painting of his father that hung at the top of the stairs. In the shadows, Richard's painted face seemed to shift, his expression one of profound, kingly disappointment. Ethan met the gaze, his own expression hard and resolved. For the first time, he did not look away. He walked down the long carpeted hall, his bare feet silent on the plush runner. Each step was a drumbeat, a march toward a destination he had been destined for since the day he arrived. Her door was at the very end of the wing. He reached for the heavy brass handle, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He expected it to be locked. He almost hoped it would be a final sign from the universe to turn back, but the handle turned smoothly, silently, in his grasp. The door was unlocked. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was bathed in the ethereal silver light of a full moon streaming through the tall French doors that led to a small balcony. And she was there, not in bed, not asleep. She was standing by the window, a slim, ghostly silhouette in a long ivory silk nightgown. She was waiting. She had known he would come. She turned slowly as he closed the door behind him, the soft click echoing in the profound silence. Her face was a pale oval in the moonlight, her expression unreadable, but her eyes, dark and deep, were fixed on his. No words were spoken, none were needed. The questions had been asked and answered in 1,000 unspoken glances, in a single furious kiss. He walked toward her, crossing the expanse of the room until he stood directly in front of her. He could see the subtle rise and fall of her chest, could smell the clean, floral scent of her skin. He slowly lifted his hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and cupped her jaw, his thumbs stroking the soft skin of her cheek. This was the true point of no return. Her reaction would decide everything. She didn't pull away. Instead, a soft, shuddering sigh escaped her lips, and she closed her eyes, leaning into his touch with a sense of profound, weary relief. It was all the permission he needed. His other hand went to the delicate straps of her nightgown, pushing the cool silk from her shoulders. The fabric whispered down her body, pooling at her feet like liquid moonlight, revealing her to him. She stood before him, naked and bathed in silver, not with shame, but with a quiet, waiting vulnerability. "Alara," he breathed, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "You're so beautiful." He led her to the bed, their movements slow, dreamlike, almost reverent. This was not the angry, desperate clash in the gallery. This was something else entirely. This was a ritual, a long overdue sacrament. He explored her body with his hands and his lips, learning the lines and curves he had only ever imagined. The soft underside of her breast, the gentle concavity of her stomach, the sharp angle of her hip bone. Every touch was a discovery, a revelation. She was responsive under his touch, her soft gasps and moans a quiet litany of pleasure that fueled his own. When he finally entered her, it was with a slowness that was almost painful, a deliberate, sacred joining. Her body welcomed him, enclosed him in a seamless velvet heat. They moved together, a slow, hypnotic rhythm that was as much about emotional release as it was about physical pleasure. In the dim light, he watched her face, her head thrown back against the pillows, her lips parted, her eyes closed in a state of pure ecstasy. He was lost in her, in the scent of her, the feel of her, the sound of her. The ghosts of the house, the looming shadow of his father, the weight of his own guilt had all faded away, leaving only this singular, perfect, and profoundly wrong moment. "Ethan!" she cried out, her voice a fractured whisper as her pleasure crested. "Don't stop!" He didn't. He held on to her, pouring all of his loneliness, his grief, and his forbidden, all-consuming desire into her, until his own release came, a shattering, soul-deep wave that left him utterly spent, his forehead resting against hers, their breathing the only sound in the universe. The first thing Ethan became aware of was the light. It was not the soft, forgiving silver of the moon, but the flat, gray, uncompromising light of dawn. It sliced through a gap in the heavy curtains, pinning a stark rectangle onto the far wall and exposing the dust motes dancing in the air. It was the light of truth, and it felt like an accusation. He was lying on his side, his arm flung across the empty space beside him. He turned his head slowly. Alara was there, curled on her side, facing him, still asleep. In the unfiltered morning light, she looked younger, more vulnerable. Her dark hair was a tangled halo on the white pillow, her long lashes resting on her cheek. Her lips, slightly parted and still swollen from his kisses, looked soft and innocent. A wave of something tender and protective washed over him, so potent it was almost painful, and then he saw it. On the mahogany nightstand, just past her shoulder, was a silver frame. In it, a photo of Alara and his father on their wedding day. Richard was beaming, his arm possessively around his young bride's waist, the very picture of a man who had acquired the most beautiful object in the world. Alara was smiling too, but even then, in that moment of supposed joy, Ethan could now see the faint, almost imperceptible shadow of melancholy in her eyes. The sight was a physical blow. Guilt, cold and nauseating, flooded him, drowning the lingering warmth of the night. He was in his father's bed. He had slept with his father's wife. He was a thief, a trespasser, a betrayer of the highest order. Every shadow in the opulent room seemed to take the shape of his father, watching him with silent condemnation. He slipped out of the bed with the stealth of a burglar, his movements careful and quiet. The air, which had felt warm and electric hours before, was now just cold against his bare skin. He gathered his discarded clothes from the floor, his eyes refusing to look at her sleeping form, as if a direct gaze would wake her and force a confrontation he was not ready for. Dressed, he stood at the door for a final moment, his hand on the knob. He was a coward. He knew it. He had taken what he wanted in the dark, and now he was fleeing from the consequences in the light. He opened the door and slipped out, closing it behind him with a barely audible click, retreating to the sterile safety of his own room. The dawn he had just run from was not the dawn of a new beginning, but the dawn of guilt. Later that morning, the awkwardness was a palpable thing, a third presence in every room they occupied. He found her in the kitchen, staring out the large bay window that overlooked the rain-soaked gardens, a coffee mug cradled in her hands. He stopped in the doorway, his throat suddenly dry. She must have heard him, but she didn't turn around. "I made a fresh pot," she said, her voice even, betraying nothing. It was so normal, so mundane, it felt insane. He poured himself a mug, the silence stretching between them, thick with the memory of skin and whispers. He wanted to say something, anything. "I'm sorry. What was that? What are we?" But the words wouldn't form. They were accomplices in a crime, too intimate for words. He drank his coffee, standing by the counter, and she continued to look out the window. They were two strangers who knew the most forbidden secrets about each other. That first day set the pattern for their new existence. In the light, they were ghosts to one another, orbiting in the vastness of the manor but never making contact. Their politeness returned, but it was now a brittle, transparent shield that barely concealed the frantic reality underneath. They were performing normalcy for an audience of ghosts, but the night changed everything. The desire, now that it had been unleashed, was a relentless, ravenous thing. It was an addiction. And like all addicts, they could not stay away from their drug. The first time after that night, it was she who came to him, a soft knock on his door long after midnight. He opened it, and she was there, wearing that same silk nightgown, her eyes dark, with a need that mirrored his own. There was no slow, reverent exploration this time. It was a quick, desperate, almost silent coupling against the closed door of his room, a frantic slaking of a thirst that had become unbearable during the long, chaste hours of the day. Their affair took root in the shadows. It was a creature of the night, fed by stolen moments in rooms they were least likely to be disturbed. In the library, with the leather-bound books of his father's legacy watching them. In a forgotten guest room in the East Wing, where the furniture was covered in white sheets, making them feel like phantoms themselves. Each encounter was a feverish, furtive act, stripped of the tenderness of their first night together. It was about the physical release, the temporary silencing of the guilt, and the loneliness. Ethan was trapped in a dizzying cycle of desire and disgust. By night, he was a man possessed, his body craving hers with a single-minded intensity that obliterated all reason. He was alive in those moments, every sense heightened, the world reduced to the scent of her skin and the sound of her pleasure. But by day, the self-loathing would return with a vengeance. He would see his reflection in a mirror and despise the man looking back. He tried to understand Alara's part in it, but she remained an enigma. In the throes of their passion, she was wild, uninhibited. But in the quiet moments after, or in the stark light of morning, her face was a calm, unreadable mask. He could never tell if she felt the same corrosive guilt that was eating him alive, or if she felt something else entirely: triumph, relief, perhaps even love. Her ambiguity was a special kind of torture, leaving him perpetually off balance, unable to grasp the nature of the sin they were so compulsively committing together. They were no longer just a grieving son and a widow. They were partners in a secret, a shared transgression that bound them together more tightly than any vow, trapping them in the gilded cage of the manor, in a desperate, repeating cycle of damnation and delight. The furtive rhythm of their affair soon became a kind of perverse new normal. Days were for ghosts and guilt. Nights were for the desperate, carnal exorcism of those same feelings. Yet, as the weeks wore on, the nature of their secret encounters began to change. The simple, frantic need for physical release started to curdle into something more complex and unsettling. The thrill of the forbidden was no longer enough. The transgression itself began to seek new, darker avenues. Ethan started to feel that their affair was no longer just about the two of them, but about a third, silent participant whose presence was inescapable, the ghost of his father. Richard was everywhere. In the lingering scent of cigar smoke in the upholstery, in the weight of the silence in the grand dining room, in the way the floorboards seemed to creak under a footstep that was not Ethan's or Alara's. And this spectral presence, instead of driving them apart, began to fuel their encounters in a way that both thrilled and horrified Ethan. The shift was initiated, as so many things were, by Alara. One night, he went to her room, his body humming with the now familiar nocturnal need, but she wasn't there. He found her waiting for him at the end of the hall, standing before the heavy paneled door of his father's study. The door was ajar, spilling a soft wedge of lamplight into the darkened corridor. She was wearing a black silk robe, and in the dim light, she looked like a priestess at the entrance to a forbidden temple. She said nothing, but her eyes, dark and glittering with an unreadable emotion, beckoned him forward. He hesitated. Of all the rooms in the house, this one was the most sacred, the most inviolable. This was Richard's fortress, the epicenter of his power and his presence. To enter it at night, with her, felt like the ultimate desecration. "Alara," he began, his voice a low protest. "We can't. Not in there." She smiled, a slow, sad, knowing smile that made the hair on his arms stand up. "But it's just a room, Ethan," she whispered, her voice a silken challenge. She turned and slipped inside, leaving him to choose between his conscience and his obsession. His obsession won. He followed her in. The air was thick with his father's scent, old leather, expensive scotch, and the faint, sweet aroma of the pipe tobacco he sometimes smoked. It was the scent of Ethan's childhood, of being summoned for a lecture or a rare formal display of praise. On the walls were photographs of Richard with powerful men, awards for his business acumen, maps of the world dotted with his corporate conquests. It was a shrine to the man's ego. And over the massive, unlit fireplace, his portrait dominated the room. It was a masterpiece of photorealism. Richard, in his prime, seated in the very leather chair that now sat empty, his expression a perfect blend of authority and cunning charm. His eyes, rendered in painstaking detail, seemed to follow Ethan as he moved into the room. Alara glided over to the enormous mahogany desk, the surface of which was still immaculately tidy. She ran her fingers along its polished edge, a gesture that was both caress and claim. Then she turned to face him, leaning back against the desk, the silk of her robe parting slightly to reveal the long line of her leg. "He spent more time with this desk than he ever did with me," she said, her voice soft but laced with a bitter edge. "Or you." The words were a key, unlocking a dark chamber in Ethan's own heart, a place where his resentment and his desire mingled. This wasn't just his father's room, it was the room that had been chosen over him, time and time again. She held out her hand. He went to her, his movements stiff, his mind screaming in protest even as his body obeyed. When he reached her, she untied the belt of her robe and let it fall to the floor. Underneath, she was wearing a delicate set of black lace lingerie, a stark, erotic contrast to the room's masculine austerity. She pulled him closer, her hands unbuttoning his shirt, her lips finding his. The kiss was different this time, slow and deliberate, a calculated act of profanity. And as they came together on the priceless Persian rug in front of the desk, the act itself became twisted, charged with a meaning that went far beyond pleasure. It was an act of rebellion. It was an act of vengeance. It was a strange and terrible form of communication with the dead. Ethan's gaze kept flicking upward, past Alara's face, to the portrait above the mantelpiece. The painted eyes of his father stared down, impassive, judging. The feeling was suffocating, a bizarre mix of shame and a perverse, triumphant thrill. He felt like a boy defiling his father's altar, and at the same time like a rival finally conquering his territory. It was the most exciting, most disgusting moment of his life. In the height of their passion, as Alara's nails dug into his back, he broke their kiss, his breath coming in ragged, horrified gasps. "Alara," he panted, the words ripped from him. "He's watching." He felt her body tense beneath his, and then she tilted her head back, a long, graceful arch of her neck, to look up at the portrait as well. A strange, wild light danced in her eyes. She pulled his head back down to hers, her voice a hot, intoxicating whisper against his ear. "I know," she breathed, a sound of pure, unadulterated pleasure. "Let him watch." The words shattered the last of his resistance. They plunged them both into a new level of depravity, a place where grief and lust and rage had merged into a single, monstrous emotion. The ghost was no longer just a witness. He was part of the act. The encounter left Ethan feeling hollowed out, tainted in a way he hadn't been before. The guilt was no longer a clean, sharp pain. It was a dirty, spreading infection. As he walked back to his room in the pre-dawn light, he felt as though the scent of the study, his father's scent, was clinging to his skin, a permanent brand of his sin. He was no longer just a man who had fallen to temptation. He was an active participant in a twisted psychodrama, dancing with his father's widow on top of his father's grave. And the most terrifying part was the dark, undeniable thrill that came with it. The act in Richard's study had irrevocably altered the landscape of their affair. It had not purged them of their demons. It had invited them in, given them names, and offered them a seat at the table. The guilt and shame that had once haunted the edges of their desire now moved to the very center, becoming a potent, perverse fuel. A strange and dangerous recklessness took hold of them. They had desecrated the holiest of holies, and the world had not ended. The foundations of the house had not crumbled. A terrible, unspoken thought began to fester between them. If they had gotten away with that, what else was there to fear? The furtive, stolen moments were no longer enough to satisfy the hunger they had unleashed. The constant suppression of the day and the frantic release of the night had created a volatile pressure within the walls of the manor and within their own bodies. It was a storm gathering strength, waiting for the right moment to break with catastrophic force. That moment arrived on a Thursday afternoon. The day was deceptively calm, with a pale, watery sun filtering through the tall library windows. Alara was on the rolling brass ladder, reaching for a book on a high shelf. She was wearing a simple, button-front dress of dark green linen. Ethan walked into the room, intending to retrieve a file, his mind on the mundane task of sorting the estate. But then he saw her. She was stretching, her body elongated and graceful, the fabric of her dress pulled taut across her back and hips. She must have sensed him, because she paused and looked down, her expression unreadable from that height. Their eyes met, and in that single, silent exchange, a fuse was lit. The polite fiction of their daytime existence, the pretense of normalcy, all of it was incinerated in a flash. There was no thought, no decision, only a raw magnetic pull that was as undeniable as gravity. He walked to the base of the ladder and simply said her name, his voice low and rough. "Alara." She descended, her eyes never leaving his. The moment her feet touched the floor, he pulled her to him. The kiss was not a greeting, it was a collision. It was a raw, bruising claiming, a desperate affirmation that this, right here, was the only thing that was real. His hands were rough in her hair, and hers were clawing at his shoulders, pulling him impossibly closer. The need was too great, too urgent for the slow journey to a bedroom. He backed her against the towering bookshelf, the hard spines of his father's first editions pressing into her back. Books tumbled to the floor with a series of soft, defeated thuds. He fumbled with the buttons of her dress, his patience snapping. With a guttural sound of frustration, he gripped the fabric at her collar and ripped it open, buttons scattered across the floor like tiny, discarded inhibitions. She gasped, a sound of shock and arousal, as he pushed the torn dress from her shoulders. They fell to the floor, landing on the thick, plush Persian rug that covered the center of the room. This was not the slow, reverent discovery of their first night, nor the psychologically twisted act in the study. This was pure, undiluted carnality. It was a storm of limbs and mouths and frantic, searching hands. All pretense of tenderness was gone, replaced by a ferocious, almost violent passion. He pushed aside the delicate lace of her panties, his movements rough and impatient. She met his ferocity with her own, her hips rising to meet his, her nails raking down his back, leaving fiery trails on his skin. This was not making love. This was a battle, a desperate, frenzied attempt to physically consume one another, to erase the world and their own guilt with the sheer, overwhelming force of their lust. The sounds they made were no longer the hushed whispers of secret lovers. They were the raw, unconcealed moans and cries of two people utterly lost to sensation. The library, once their sanctuary of quiet conversation, was now filled with the sound of their ragged breathing, the slap of skin on skin, the name of a dead man's wife being cried out in ecstasy. He looked down at her, her face flushed, her eyes glazed with pleasure, her dark hair a wild storm against the intricate patterns of the rug. He could smell the intoxicating, primal scent of their mingled sweat and arousal, a scent that overpowered the familiar smell of old paper and leather. He felt the taut, perfect curve of her buttocks in his hands, pressing her harder against him. He was losing himself, his identity, everything, in the crucible of this act. He needed an anchor. He needed to hear his own name. "Say it, Alara," he growled, his voice a ragged command against her ear. "Say my name." For a moment, she only moaned, lost in her own world, but he repeated it, his voice harder, more desperate. "Say it." Her eyes fluttered open and focused on his. "Ethan," she gasped, the word both a plea and a prayer. "Oh God, Ethan, more." Harder. Hearing his name on her lips in that place, in that moment of absolute abandon, was the final undoing. It was a victory, a conquest, a declaration that this moment at least belonged to him, not to the ghost that haunted the house. He poured all of his rage, his confusion, his forbidden love, and his toxic desire into a final, powerful thrust. Their climax was a simultaneous, violent explosion, a white-hot flash of sensation that left them both shuddering and breathless, their bodies slick with sweat, collapsed on the floor like the survivors of a shipwreck. For a long time, they just lay there, tangled together on the rug, the afternoon sun streaming through the window, illuminating the chaos they had created, the scattered books, the torn dress, the two broken people who had just reached the absolute peak of their passion, and in doing so, had perhaps nowhere else to go but down. The inferno of their passion in the library did not leave a warm, glowing ember in its wake. It left only ashes. In the days that followed, a cold, brittle silence descended upon the house, thicker and more suffocating than any that had come before. The ferocity of their last encounter had been a peak, but it was a desolate one, offering no beautiful vista, only a terrifying view of how far they had fallen. They had burned through the last of their restraints, and the reality of their situation, stark and unforgiving, began to creep in from the edges. The ghost of Richard no longer felt like a presence to be defied. He felt like a debt coming due. They were living in a bubble of lust and shared transgression, but it was a fragile thing, and the outside world was a needle, sharp and ready to pierce it. The first intrusion came via a telephone call. Ethan was in the study, a room he now actively avoided, but was forced to use for estate business when the phone rang, its shrill summons an assault on the quiet. It was Mr. Abernathy, his father's lawyer, his voice a dry rustle of paper and professionalism. He spoke of probate court, of asset liquidation, of tax implications and beneficiary clauses. He referred to Alara as the widow and to Ethan as the primary heir. The cold, legal terms stripped their relationship of all its heat and intimacy, recasting them as what they were in the eyes of the world, two separate parties in a financial transaction precipitated by death. As Abernathy droned on, Ethan stared at the portrait of his father. The man's confident smirk seemed to mock him. He was a fool, a boy playing games in his father's house while the real world, the world of consequences and legal documents, was closing in. When he hung up, the desire he felt for Alara was, for the first time, tainted with a cold layer of suspicion. What was he to her? A lover? Or a complication in the settling of the estate? A variable to be managed? The second intrusion was far more personal. The doorbell rang 2 days later, a sound so unexpected it made them both jump. Ilara's younger sister, Chloe, stood on the doorstep, a whirlwind of bright scarves and cheerful, concerned energy. She was the complete opposite of Ilara, open, effusive, and utterly artless. Her presence in the heavy, secretive atmosphere of the manor was like turning on all the lights at a seance. "Ellie!" she cried, enveloping her sister in a hug. "You haven't been answering my texts!" "I was worried sick. And you must be Ethan. It's so good to finally meet you properly under, well, you know." Chloe's bright, observant eyes missed nothing. Her innocent questions were like tiny, expertly placed explosives. "My God, this house is enormous. Don't you two go crazy rattling around in here all alone?" she asked over tea. "Ellie, you look pale. Are you sleeping? You two seem so tense." Ethan and Ilara exchanged a fleeting, panicked look. They were forced to perform, to play the roles of the grieving widow and the supportive stepson. The effort was exhausting. Every polite phrase, every shared, sad smile felt like a lie. Ethan watched Ilara interact with her sister, saw the easy affection, the shared history. He was an outsider. He saw the woman Chloe knew and realized how little he knew of the real Ilara himself. He knew her body, her taste, the sounds she made in the throes of passion. But the woman herself? She was a stranger. That night, after Chloe had retired to a guest room, the strain of the day finally snapped Ethan's control. He found Ilara in the darkened living room, staring into the fireplace. The performance was over, and the silence was once again charged with tension. He could no longer bear the not knowing, the ambiguity that she wrapped around herself like a cloak. "That was quite a show today," he began, his voice hard, devoid of the passion it usually held when he spoke to her. The bereaved family, anyone would have believed it. She turned to him, her expression weary. "What did you want me to do, Ethan? Tell her the truth? I want the truth from you," he shot back, his voice rising. "After everything we've done in this house, in his bed, in his office, on the floor of his library, I have a right to know. What is this, Ilara? What do you want from me?" He was begging, he realized. Begging for an anchor, for some emotional truth to justify the spectacular wreckage he had made of his conscience. He wanted her to say she loved him. He wanted her to say this was real. He needed it to be more than just a sordid secret. Her face, illuminated by a stray moonbeam, was a mask of sorrow. She looked at him for a long, silent moment, and in her eyes he saw not love, not cunning, but a bottomless well of pain. "Don't you know?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I wanted not to be alone." The answer was a punch to the gut. It was not the reassurance he craved. It was not a confession of love or a declaration of war. It was something far worse. A simple, selfish human truth that offered him no comfort at all. It was an admission that he was not special, but functional. A warm body to fill a cold and empty space. In that moment, the fierce, all-consuming passion that had bound them together felt like a cheap illusion. The spell was broken. The cracks, which had been spidering just beneath the surface, now split wide open, revealing the cold, empty void between them. The house was a prison once more, but now they were in separate, solitary cells, the silence between them no longer full of unspoken desire but of unspeakable disappointment. The fight, or rather the quiet, devastating implosion of their affair, left a void in the house that no amount of furtive passion could ever fill again. The truth of Ilara's words, "I wanted not to be alone," had poisoned everything. It stripped their frantic couplings of their epic, tragic quality and reduced them to something pathetic, the desperate fumbling of two lonely people. The spell was broken, and all that remained was the wreckage. The end came, as it had to, with a final word from the ghost who had presided over their every sin. Mr. Abernathy arrived the following week for the final signing of the estate papers. He was, as always, the picture of discretion, but his eyes held a flicker of pity as he looked between the two of them, standing a careful 6 feet apart in the cavernous foyer. After the last document was signed, the lawyer cleared his throat and produced a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with Richard's wax signet. "Your father left this for you, Ethan," he said, handing it over. "His instructions were that you were to receive it only after all other matters were settled." Later, alone in the suffocating silence of the study, Ethan broke the seal. The letter was written in his father's familiar, arrogant script. It was not a letter of fatherly affection. It was, like the man himself, pragmatic, controlling, and brutally perceptive. After a few paragraphs of business instructions came the final, devastating blow. "I was not blind in my final year, son," Richard had written. "A man in my position learns to see the cracks in his own foundation. The marriage was a comfort, but it was not a success. She was lonely. And I saw the way you looked at her that last summer, and more importantly, I saw the way she looked at you. There is a certain inevitability to these things. Do not mistake my foresight for approval, but my one true regret is leaving her adrift in a world that will be unkind to her. If you find it in your heart, see that she is taken care of. It is the one debt I leave unpaid." Ethan read the words twice, then a third time. A cold, hollow feeling spread through his chest. This wasn't absolution. It was the final, perfect act of control from a master manipulator. His great passionate rebellion, his soul-defining transgression, had been anticipated, perhaps even implicitly permitted. He hadn't been a rebel defying a king. He had been a predictable pawn, moving exactly as the king had foreseen. The affair wasn't a fire he had started, but a sad, pathetic little blaze his father had left the kindling for. The weight of his guilt didn't lift. It simply changed, becoming heavier, more complex, and infinitely sadder. He found Alara in the library. He didn't speak, but simply handed her the letter. He watched her face as she read it, her expression betraying nothing but a deep, deep weariness. She looked up at him, her eyes glistening. "He knew," she whispered. "He always knew everything." In that moment, all the anger, suspicion, and passion was gone, replaced by a shared, tragic understanding. They were just two people, hopelessly entangled in the web of a dead man's legacy. "I have to leave, Alara," he said, the words tasting like ash. "I can't stay here. We can't build anything on this." She gave a single, slow nod, a gesture of quiet, heartbreaking acceptance. "I know," she said. Their farewell was as silent and empty as the house around them. There were no tears, no final, desperate kiss. Just a long, final look, a look that acknowledged everything that had passed between them and everything that could never be. He packed a single bag, walked out the heavy front door, and didn't look back, leaving the ghost, the widow, and a part of his own soul behind in the silent, sprawling manor. Months passed. Autumn gave way to a bitter winter. Ethan was back in New York, back in his clean, minimalist apartment that was the architectural antithesis of the manor. He worked relentlessly, trying to build a new life over the ruins of the old one. He tried to date, but every woman's touch felt foreign, every perfume smelled wrong. He was haunted, a man living with a ghost that wasn't his father, but the memory of a woman in a house of secrets. One evening, a small, square package arrived by courier. There was no return address. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a book. It was a first edition of The Sun Also Rises, its blue leather binding worn and familiar. He didn't need to wonder who had sent it. He opened the cover expecting a note, an explanation, anything, but the pages were empty of any new inscription. He lifted the book to his face, and a faint, almost imperceptible scent rose from the old paper, jasmine and sandalwood. Her scent, it was a ghost in itself, an olfactory memory that instantly transported him back to the dimly lit library, to the feel of her hand under his, to the taste of her lips, to the ruinous, beautiful, terrible beginning of it all. He sank into his chair, the book held tightly in his hands. It wasn't a plea to return, nor was it a final goodbye. It was a reminder, a quiet, elegant, and utterly devastating statement that what had happened between them was real, and that he would never, ever be free.